Hello, good morning everyone. It's 7 o'clock. It looks like the game is over for the tennis star Novak Djokovic. The world number one has flown into a storm in Australia over his COVID vaccine exemption. We'll have the latest as he faces deportation. Back here, as travel restrictions are eased, we'll speak to the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps about the government's strategy for tackling the spread of Omicron. Also ahead, pay attention and focus. We'll speak to the best-selling author Johann Hari on his battle to get kids to look up from their phones. Plus, keep on walking. The great-granddad with a quadruple heart bypass is going to walk 10 miles a day, every day this year. It's Thursday, the 6th of January. Facing deportation, the world number tennis one Novak Djokovic has his visa to enter Australia cancelled after an outcry over his COVID vaccine exemption.
Rules are rules, and there are no special cases.
With nearly 1 million waiting for treatment, MPs warn plans to tackle the NHS backlog could be derailed by a lack of staff.
We're really calling upon the government and the Secretary of State is to not keep burying their heads in the sand. There is a massive problem and it needs sorting.
I'm live at the Great Western Hospital in Swindon, where high demand for COVID beds and staff shortages are causing increasing demand.
Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyer demands a retrial after one of the jurors who convicted her reveals he was the victim of sexual abuse. Remaining defiant, 1 year on from the Capitol riots in Washington, Donald Trump's team maintained the US election was rigged.
Former President Trump is still absolutely of the belief that he won the election in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the weather after a frosty start for many, strong winds, rain and hill snow will spread eastwards. Hello, good morning. The world number one tennis player Novak Djokovic is facing deportation from Australia. He was refused entry by border officials in Melbourne because he didn't meet the country's COVID vaccine requirements. It means his hopes of defending his Australian Open title appear to be over. Sky's Shaman Freeman-Powell reports.
It's not the way the tennis world number one had expected to enter Australia to defend his Open title. Rushed into a quarantine hotel in a van, surrounded by guards in protective clothing. Instead of being fully vaccinated, Novak Djokovic had secured a medical exemption before leaving Europe. But he was blocked by Australia's border force, who said his visa didn't tally with that medical exemption. His coach, Goran Ivanisevic, was allowed through, but was stuck at the airport, waiting and writing, not the most usual trip, down under. Australia's Prime Minister went in front of the cameras to confirm Djokovic's visa had been cancelled and he'd be getting no special treatment.
Rules are rules, and there are no special cases. It is not appropriate for me to go into Mr Djokovic's own medical history. That would not be a fair thing for us to do. They are matters for him to discuss in terms of his own medical history. But all I can say is that the evidence for medical exemption that was provided was found to be insufficient.
Almost all of the players and staff at the Australian Open have been vaccinated. Some have also been given exemptions. But the Djokovic case has infuriated people in the world's most locked-down city.
All of a sudden he's been exempt and can play, and I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I won't be watching it.
Even the Djokovic fans gathered outside Melbourne airport say they think pulling out is the only option.
Well, obviously we are disappointed, but that's something we can't really change. We have no influence.
Serbia's president has even waded in. He spoke to the world number one on the phone and hit out at his treatment on Instagram, promising to step in. I told Novak that the whole of Serbia is with him and that our bodies are doing everything to see that the harassment of the world's best tennis player is brought to an end immediately. In line with all norms of international law, Serbia will fight for Novak, truth and justice. Djokovic has launched an appeal. It's being heard today, But as it stands, his route into Australia is blocked, and his stance on vaccination leaves him in this quarantine hotel, instead of defending his title. Shimon Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Well, joining me live from Adelaide is Sky News Australia's Joel Phillip. And Joel, as Shimon was saying, that appeal, we're due to hear a result of it quite soon, aren't we?
Well, it appears that it has just begun again in the Federal Circuit Court in Melbourne. It was adjourned earlier today, but indeed for the application process to go through, but it has just begun once again. It is not clear at this stage if we'll get an outcome tonight or if Djokovic will be staying for the coming days here in Melbourne. What's been heard so far in the court is a discussion about whether he can get access to a tennis court while the situation is unfolding, and Tennis Australia has requested that they find out if he can play by no later than Tuesday next week. The judge responded to that by saying the tail won't be wagging the dog here. Now, his lawyers are mounting a challenge on the denial of his visa to Australia, saying that it was unfair and unreasonable, among other things. Now, in this situation, you mentioned the medical exemption. What it's being reported here has occurred is that Djokovic has attempted to claim that he is naturally immune and entered the country via that precipice or situation. And although it's used in other parts of the world as a relevant form of exemption, it is not used here in Australia. The Australian government has confirmed that today, and it's also being reported that they wrote to Tennis Australia on various occasions, letting them know that that's the case. So how it got to this situation, and that the health experts and the Immigration Department, that Tennis Australia and, of course, the world's #1 superstar Novak himself didn't communicate to each other, is not clear at the moment. We'll see what unfolds in the coming days.
We will indeed. Joel, thanks very much for that. Now, pre-departure COVID testing has been removed for eligible, fully vaccinated people leaving the UK. This, along with other changes to test for travellers, will make it easier and cheaper for travel to and from the UK from tomorrow. Well, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, joins me now. Mr Shapps, we're told that Omicron is everywhere, yet all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of these rules being removed. Are we not letting down our defences a little bit too early?
No, definitely not. This was always brought in on a temporary basis, and it did its job. We, since bringing in the red list and then these additional tests, managed to get 13 million extra jabs, the booster jab in people's arms. So it served a purpose. Obviously, Omicron is global. It's worldwide. Everybody has it now. The proportion that comes in from overseas is completely is minuscule by comparison with the numbers that are actually here. So it's now widespread. And in a sense, Omicron testing has outlived its usefulness, so we're able to withdraw it from international travel today.
So that's Omicron.
Of course, can carry on testing.
Sorry to agree, but that's Omicron. What about other variants? By doing this, we are potentially letting loads of other variants in without testing people before they come to the UK.
Well, because it's global, we're just as likely to perhaps have a variant here. We saw that last year, or the year before now, with the Kent variant, also called Alpha. So, of course, a variant can occur anywhere. This country does do more genomic sequencing. That's when you find out what the variant might be than any other country in the world. So we're still carrying on that massive sequencing program. We'll carry on doing that because if you get a positive lateral flow test after you've travelled, and that is the one test that remains, you must take a lateral flow test by day 2. And if you do get a positive, then that needs to be PCR'd on the NHS and sequenced. So we've still got that protection in place, but we think this is proportionate. A lot of jobs depend on travel, a lot of jobs depend on tourism, and we need to keep these measures in line with actually what's going on with Omicron around the world, which it is everywhere now. It's the predominant strain of coronavirus.
Not everyone's convinced either. The Welsh Government Health Minister said that she was making the changes reluctantly and stressed that the Welsh Government was still advising against all but essential international travel. Why do you think they're not concerned?
Yeah, look, it's always been for the different devolved administrations around the UK to decide. As far as I'm aware, actually, the whole of the UK is going to be moving on this together. So these rules will apply everywhere. And these are judgment calls. It's absolutely right to say. But I do have to say, the idea that somehow the United Kingdom is safe and secure, but if you travel outside of our borders, then somehow it will be it's a dangerous world out there. I think sort of belies the truth, which is that Omicron is everywhere around the world. We've got very significant testing in place. And I don't think any country does more testing than we do per head of population. So, for example, on Tuesday this week, I saw there were over 2 million coronavirus tests which took place. And so we keep a very, very close eye on these things. But people still need to be able to get around and see family, perhaps elsewhere in the world. Business needs to be done elsewhere. And as I say, we have pretty high levels of coronavirus here. So it's not like if you go abroad, you're necessarily going somewhere with higher levels. You may well be somewhere with lower levels. So we just didn't see the reason to keep what were always temporary measures in place for a moment longer than was useful. And in a sense, they just outlived their usefulness when it comes to international travel.
Do we have a shortage of tests?
No, we don't.
Because a number of spokesman yesterday said that changes were to make the best use of our testing system at a time of high prevalence. It slightly suggests that there's a certain amount of prioritising.
Yeah, no, that was specifically in reference to not requiring to do a PCR test. If you're asymptomatic and you take a lateral flow, you no longer need to confirm that with a PCR test. So that was in reference to something slightly different. And yes, it is true to say that we want to make sure that we're focusing those tests on critical workers on the front line, as for example, with transport workers or with health workers, to make sure they're available. So we don't want to over-test for no reason. But remember, the travel tests were always provided by the private sector, and that single lateral flow that's still required will still be a private sector test. But we've got a huge amount of testing available. As I mentioned, we tested 2 million in a single day on Tuesday, and there are tests available for people who need to get PCR tests. Lateral flow supply is very much available. Sometimes delivery of those tests is proving challenging, and we're increasing the number of delivery routes available through the Royal Mail and elsewhere as well.
Could you just clarify the rules on testing for us? The advice seems to be that if you have one of the 3 main symptoms, that you should get a PCR, otherwise not. Now, this is confusing quite a lot of people because a lot of people with Omicron have aches and pains and not necessarily a temperature and a cough. Should they just do a lateral flow test?
Yeah, that's right. So just to clarify this, if you have one of the main symptoms that they're listed on the NHS website, then by all means book a PCR test. For other people who are perhaps going about their normal lives but maybe feel they'll be in a position where they'll meet vulnerable people, that's where the lateral flow tests are available. I know a lot of people over Christmas, myself included, taking lateral flow tests before going to see my elderly parents, and that's good practice, and it helps to protect everyone. In fact, in my family, my eldest son took a test, had absolutely no symptoms whatsoever, and found he was positive, and then had to go and self-isolate for 9 days until he got 2 days of negative lateral flow tests. So that's the purpose of lateral flow tests, particularly good where people are asymptomatic, and it can find people who've got cases. But PCR tests where you are symptomatic, that's the message.
And it seems to me that the current message from the government generally seems to be that we are just going to have to live with COVID. As you were saying, it's not the case that there's a big bad world out there. We have a lot of it in the country. But there's a lot of messages coming from the NHS, from staff, and we have this report out today about pressure on the NHS. And they feel that actually living with it is just not possible, that we are reaching a crisis point in the NHS. What do you say to that?
We've always known in dealing with Omicron, and this is where our plan B has been in place, that we are, if you like, always trying to find the right compromise between going too tight on restrictions, lockdowns, and let's face it, they have a lot of costs connected, monetary costs, obviously, to the economy, but also to people's jobs, also to people's mental health of these lockdowns. And then again, not wanting our hospitals to be overrun. And this is where I think the Plan B has been shown to be the right approach so far. We know that
but we've got 20 hospitals with critical warnings at the moment. That doesn't seem to be like it's going swimmingly for them.
Yeah, so there are 137 trusts. There are 24 which are critical. It's not entirely unusual for hospitals to go critical over the winter, often with things like the flu pandemic, but there are very real pressures, which I absolutely recognise. And we know what it's like when these hospitals are under pressure. My dad was in hospital this time last year when there were 40,000 people in hospital with coronavirus, and the pressures are very real. This year we've got 5,000 more doctors, 10,000 more nurses in place, and it's very important that we do provide all those resources. And we've provided an extra £5.9 billion to hospitals, a £36 billion catch-up programme as well. But I do absolutely recognise those pressures. As I say, what we want to do is steer the country through the Omicron wave. And I think so far Plan B has shown to have been the right way forward, not shutting down the whole country yet again with all the costs to people's mental health and elsewhere, but making sure that we're providing the extra resources to hospitals. Unfortunately,
in terms of those extra resources,
less severe.
In terms of those extra resources, a report out from MPs today saying that NHS waiting lists, which are already huge, are to double by 2025. Huge numbers in the North East especially. What is your solution to that?
Yeah, I mentioned the amount of money that we're putting into tackling those waiting lists. So we've got a £5.9 billion catch-up, the £36 billion that I mentioned. It's one of the reasons why we took what most people would accept was a difficult decision, but nonetheless, I think, worthwhile one last year, which is to say that we will be having that national insurance rise in order to pay, in part, for catch-up on the number of operations and routine procedures, which, because we've now been tackling coronavirus for, what is it, nearly 2 years, have by necessity in some cases not been able to take place. We want to make sure that we catch up with that. We're putting record sums into our NHS. We love the NHS. We want it to be able to function. I think most people watching a programme accept that, of course, these have been exceptional times. We've never faced anything like a virus like this before in modern history.
Yeah, and in terms of support in the Cabinet, Jacob Rees-Mogg not quite as in favour of the national insurance rise as others, we understand from yesterday's Cabinet meeting. How did his suggestion that should be scrapped, the rise, go down?
Well, cabinets take place in private, so I'm not going to get into commenting on Cabinet meeting content. We have a plan. It is to catch up on things like the backlog in NHS care, which has come about, unfortunately, through coronavirus, and that plan is being put into place. It is also true to say that we want to make sure that we relieve tax pressures on public as and when we can, but that has to be done in line with.
The government could change their mind on this and scrap it.
Oh, well, look, we're absolutely committed to doing two things. One, catching up with the backlog in the NHS, and that's why we have this national insurance increase specifically for that purpose. And two, sorting out the long-term issue of social care, where people lose their homes if they have specific types of illnesses, for example, dementia, which has always seemed to me to be cruel and unfair, particularly when you're helped by the NHS if you had something else and that was eventually the thing which you passed away from. So, no, we're absolutely committed to making those changes. It's an historic change that I think will bring a lot of security to families up and down the country. So we'll certainly be doing that.
OK, Grant Shapps, good to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us.
You too. Thanks very much.
Well, as we just mentioned, MPs are warning that plans to tackle the record waiting list for NHS treatment could be derailed by emergency care and a lack of staff. A backlog of nearly 6 million people in England. Ivor Bennett reports.
3 patients with different needs in different parts of the country, all facing the same unbearable wait for treatment.
This isn't living, this is existing at the moment. It's just hideous. It's affecting literally every single part of my life.
I feel as though I've been forgotten. Perhaps they hope that my age will see me off before anything else happens.
You learn to put a bit of a brave face on it, if you like, but that fear is always there in the background.
There are nearly 6 million people waiting for planned treatment, and there are fears this could double over the next 3 years. Of those already on the list, 300,000 have been waiting for more than a year, and 12,000 more than 2 years. Now MPs are warning that government plans to tackle the backlog could be derailed by record demands on emergency care and a lack of staff. There are nearly 100,000 vacancies for NHS positions.
All we hear is about the concerns we have, but there's no action plan. We're really calling upon the government and the Secretary of State is to not keep burying their heads in the sand. There is a massive problem and it needs sorting.
Some hospitals, like this one in North London, have found ways to limit the backlog. This is one of 7 in the local area that have pooled resources so that patients can be treated more quickly if they're willing to travel. But it's only ever going to be a quick fix. A long-term solution is desperately needed.
The government says it's provided nearly £6 billion to tackle the backlog and pledged more in the future. But experts say money isn't the problem.
The fact that's going to limit the rate at how quickly that money translates into better services for patients is staffing. Can you find enough staff, whether domestically or recruiting internationally, to make the best use of that money so we can see the taxpayer investment resulting in shorter waits for care?
A knock-on of COVID, which, like the virus, isn't going away. The backlog will undoubtedly get worse before it gets better. Ivor Bennett, Sky News.
Well, let's talk to Dan Whitehead. He's at the Great Western Hospital in Swindon, which has declared a critical incident. What is the situation there, Dan?
Well, this is one of 20 NHS trusts across England which have declared these internal critical incidents. It did so on Tuesday, and to our understanding this morning, it is still within what is its highest level of internal alert system. What it essentially means is that they can call on extra support and extra resources and to look to discharge extra patients from the hospital. They are under extreme pressure, extremely busy, is what the hospital says inside. Now, as of yesterday morning, they had 72 COVID patients inside the hospital behind me. 3 of those were inside intensive care. But the problem is exacerbated because of the staff shortages due to sickness due to COVID-19. So it is almost a perfect storm of an increasing number of people coming into the urgent care and emergency departments here, a rising number of COVID-19 patients and those staff shortages. Now, on the website for the NHS Trust, they've urged the families of patients inside the hospital to do all they can to see if they can help look after their patients at home. They talk about collecting their loved ones promptly, stocking the medicine cabinet at home and arranging their own transport to get their loved ones back home. It's all about clearing the backlog of beds. And as we heard in Ivor's report just then, nearly 6 million people waiting for treatments on NHS waiting lists, and that is why the Health and Care Recovery Plan is being urged from the committee to ensure the government does more to try and clear this backlog at what is already a very difficult time for the NHS and hospitals right across England.
Dan, thanks very much. Well, let's take a look at the latest daily COVID data for the UK. And 194,747 new cases of coronavirus have been reported. 334 more deaths also. Although this is a jump, the number does take into account those since the 1st of January because of the lag in data reporting over the bank holiday. That takes the number of those who've died within 28 days of a positive test to 149,284. Well, on the Sky News Daily Podcast today, we look at the pressure rising Omicron cases and staff absences are putting on the NHS. You can find it from your podcast supplier or by scanning the QR code on your screen right now. Still to come on the programme, the former Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, will be here to discuss the emergency care crisis and growing waiting lists. We'll talk to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, who's calling for a new tax on energy companies to help families cope with rising gas prices. And the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Jonathan Ashworth, joins me at 8:05 as more NHS trusts around the country declare critical incidents. Well, in other news today, police in Kazakhstan's largest city, Almaty, say that tens of rioters have been, in their words, eliminated. Authorities and protesters clashed in the city's main square, where hundreds have been protesting the rise in fuel prices. It comes as a Russian-led military alliance of ex-Soviet states has said it will send peacekeeping forces into Kazakhstan at the president's request. This year's Grammy Awards in Los Angeles have been postponed because of coronavirus for the second year in a row. The Recording Academy and CBS said the decision to press ahead with the 2022 ceremony simply contained too many risks. Italy will introduce mandatory vaccination for over 50s from next month. It's already been compulsory for teachers and healthcare workers since October, but the tightening of rules was announced on the day Italy reported record-high COVID infections. Around 90% of over 50s in Italy have received 2 doses so far. Anyone not vaccinated could be fined at least €600. Ghislaine Maxwell's defence team are calling for a retrial after one of the jurors who convicted her revealed that he was a victim of sexual abuse. She was found guilty last week of recruiting underage girls to be sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Joe Pike reports now from New York.
She is a convicted child sex trafficker. But for how long? After a member of the jury that found Ghislaine Maxwell guilty put that very verdict in doubt. In a media interview, juror Scotty David said he had been a victim of child sexual abuse and that he discussed that experience during jury deliberations. Yet in a pre-trial questionnaire, all potential jurors were asked, have you or a friend or family member ever been a victim of sexual harassment, sexual abuse or sexual assault? They could select yes, they had, yes, a friend or family member had, or no. Being a victim of sexual abuse would not have automatically excluded this man from being a juror, but it may have affected the jury selection process. He says he flew through the questionnaire, doesn't remember that particular question, but would have answered it honestly. It's now up to the judge to investigate exactly what happened, work out if this man has been truthful, and decide whether any of this affects the fairness of Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. One former prosecutor argues retrials are rarely granted.
It's very common for defense attorneys to use the comments of jurors after there's a verdict and then to go to court with a motion and try to overturn the verdict by citing the jurors' comments. It's extremely common. It is not extremely common for that type of motion by the defense to be successful. It just isn't, because we know that jurors are human beings and that they bring to the process all kinds of life experiences.
Ghislaine Maxwell's lawyers want a retrial soon. We'll find out in the coming weeks if they'll get it and whether we'll see 12 new jurors in these seats. Joe Pike, Sky News, New York.
Time to get a look at the weather now.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It's going to turn wet and windy from the west today with snow on the hills. Britain mostly dry and calm with an extensive frost, severe in places. Ireland and Northern Ireland will see any frost soon lifting as wind and rain spread from the west. Northern and Western Britain will turn wet and windy this morning with coastal gales. There'll be snow on the hills and low levels from the north in a time. Elsewhere, eastern England will stay fine.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up after the break, the former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt will be here to discuss the emergency care crisis and growing waiting lists in the NHS. The Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, has defended the government's handling of backlogs in the NHS. Mr Shapps told me earlier that it had to take difficult spending decisions to ensure that the NHS could cope.
We're absolutely committed to doing two things. One, catching up with the backlog in the NHS, and that's why we have this national insurance increase specifically for that purpose. And two, sorting out the long-term issue of social care, where people lose their homes if they have specific types of illnesses, for example, dementia, which has always seemed to me to be cruel and unfair, particularly when you're helped by the NHS if you had something else and that was eventually the thing which you passed away from. So, no, we're absolutely committed to making those changes. It's an historic change that I think will bring a lot of security to families up and down the country.
Well, political correspondent Tamara Cohen is with me now, and this is in response to the Health and Social Care Committee, who are putting out a report today showing the extent of the backlog within the NHS.
Yes, absolutely. It's nearly 6 million already, and COVID, the Omicron wave, has just made it worse because the NHS is trying to get through all those procedures that were delayed in the last wave, and then you've got all this increased pressure on hospitals from COVID patients and increasingly from staff being off, which means that hospitals are in such a difficult spot. Nonetheless, no political appetite is pretty clear for more restrictions, so they're going to have to try and ride that out as best they can. Now, an interesting little row is developing in government now, because you remember back in September, Boris Johnson announced that there was going to be a rise in national insurance in order to help solve the social care crisis, but also to help the NHS recover and cut the backlog. Now, that's coming in on the 1st of April. It's a pretty steep one. It's going to cost someone on the average salary £250 a year. And I think we're now seeing Tory MPs very concerned that, along with rising energy bills and rising inflation, people are really going to be feeling the squeeze this year. We understand in Cabinet yesterday, when they discussed COVID, Jacob Rees-Mogg said, look, why don't we not raise this national insurance tax? Now, I don't think that's going to happen, and Grant Shapps made a pretty staunch defence of why it's needed. This is what he said.
We haven't got that grab, but essentially he wouldn't comment on what was said in Cabinet. He said it was all private, but he made it really clear, didn't he, that the government is committed to this. So sort of knocked down any suggestion. And I think I then asked him, you know, is the government...
Well, he said it's crucial to clear... If we want to clear the backlog, it's crucial to get this extra money in. But I think we're already seeing... You saw yesterday with Boris Johnson in Parliament, every Conservative and Labour MP asking him about cost of living issues. I think there's going to be real pressure to find something to ease that strain.
OK, Tamara, thanks very much. Well, let's get more on this. We're joined now by the former Health Secretary and the Chair of the Commons Health and Social Care Committee, Jeremy Hunt. And you, of course, chairing this committee, which has released this report today about the backlog. It's pretty desperate stuff, isn't it? It's a pretty damning report, massive backlog of operations. The report describes it as an unquantifiable challenge. The number of children admitted to the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service up 94%. People feeling abandoned by the NHS. Where do you start? What's your greatest area of concern?
Well, we do give the government credit for the fact that it's perhaps solved the most difficult problem of all, which is what Tamara was alluding to just then, which is finding the money to address these problems. The £12 billion rise in national insurance funded through the new Health and Social Care Levy will make a massive difference. But the result of that is that people aren't worrying now across the NHS about money. What they're worrying about is workforce. They're finding it incredibly difficult to get the doctors, nurses, care workers, the crucial people to deliver this extra care just aren't there. The Health Foundation say that it'll take about 4,000 more doctors and 17,000 more nurses to deal with the backlog. And we haven't had a plan from the government as to where those doctors and nurses are going to come from. And that is the biggest single gap at the moment.
So did you actually just say that people in the NHS aren't worried about money? Because I just sort of think that beggars belief. I mean, it is all about money, isn't it? It's not about the number of staff you have. It's about the money to pay for those staff. If you haven't got the money to pay for the staff, you can't have the staff. They're not going to work for free.
Well, curiously, you know, in many periods in the NHS's history, there have been big debates about money. But right now, particularly after this £12 billion rise, people, of course, welcome additional funding. But the funding is there. What they're saying is, what hospitals are saying is we have the funding. We just can't recruit the doctors and nurses with that funding because we can't find them. And what we need is a plan. And so one of the things we say is that we're concerned that we're not training enough doctors and nurses for the future. We recommend the government has an independent study every few years as to how many doctors and nurses we should be training. They've rejected that. We hope they'll change their mind on that because we really do need to give people confidence that we're training enough doctors and nurses for the future, and they don't have that confidence at the moment.
I mean, the fact that we don't know how many doctors and nurses and care staff are being trained seems astonishing. I mean, clearly COVID's had an impact, but a lot of these problems are long-term problems within the NHS. That there'll be some who'll say that this is a bit rich coming from a health secretary, a man who was health secretary for 6 years out of the last 12 years of the Conservative government. I mean, a lot of these problems are problems that you should have solved, and a lot of these problems are legacy problems from your time when you were in charge.
Well, I'm sure I could have done some things better, but in this particular area, I did make a lot of progress. I set up 5 new medical schools. I increased the number of doctors and nurses we trained by 25%. But what I'm saying is we are going to continually need to refine the numbers that we train, the number of new specialties that we develop new skills for as new technologies, new treatments, new medicines come on stream. And we need to solve this problem once and for all. And that's why this report is saying, let's have an independent study every 2 years where someone looks carefully at the number of doctors that we're going to need in 10, 15, 20 years' time and really make sure we're training them. And that's what we're recommending this morning. We're also saying that you can't just have a strategy based on the 6 million people on the waiting list, because if emergency care falls over, the whole NHS falls over. We saw this week how 17 hospitals in the Northwest have cancelled all their elective care because of problems in their emergency care and issues with Omicron. So you have to have an encompassing solution that looks at social care, mental health, primary care, emergency care, as well as those long waiting lists.
But is the solution to the issues facing the NHS at the moment, let's count how many doctors and nurses there are going to be every 2 years? I think a lot of people would just see essentially what we're hearing from various people. One union saying we're heading for a perfect storm. Your report itself says that there are NHS staff who say no amount of money will make them stay in the NHS. It seems to me from this report that the NHS is entirely broken and that the party that you belong to have been in government for 12 years and have to take the responsibility for that.
Well, I think the NHS has improved in many ways, but we've just come through the biggest challenge in its history, which is a pandemic, which was incredibly difficult for everyone in the NHS. They did an absolutely fantastic job. And we look at the NHS through that lens, and we're saying, look, this has been really hard. What do we need to do now to help the NHS get through this and set it up for the future? And I think if you talk to people on the front line, they will say that there are workforce shortages in every area. It's the biggest thing on most people's minds. And they understand that the government hasn't got a silver bullet. It can't suddenly magic up lots more doctors and nurses. It takes 7 years to train a doctor, 10 years to train a GP, and 3 years to train a nurse. So these things can't be solved overnight, but they would like to know that there's a long-term plan in place and that it's not always going to be like this, and that over a period of time, those workforce shortages will ease. And that's what we are recommending in this report would make a big difference, both to the morale of people on the front line and to the practical ability of the NHS to deliver the excellent service that we all want.
Jeremy Hunt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, new research suggests air pollution in urban areas across the world contributed to 1.8 million excess deaths in 2019. Nearly 2 million cases of asthma in children were blamed on nitrogen dioxide in the air in the same year. Aisha Zahid reports.
Ella was only 9 years old when she died following a severe asthma attack. In the last few years of her life, she'd been admitted to hospital 27 times and suffered multiple seizures. In a landmark ruling in 2020, a coroner said excessive air pollution contributed to her death.
We will never know, really, when Ella's problems really started. The only thing I can say to you was 3 months before her 7th birthday, that's when we first noticed it. She was born right next to the South Circular, and obviously that's where her final breath was taken. So for all of Ella's life, she was breathing illegal air.
Air pollution led to 1.8 million excess deaths in cities across the globe in 2019, according to new research. In the same year, nearly 2 million asthma cases among children worldwide were attributed to nitrogen dioxide pollution. And modelling suggests 2.5 billion people are living in urban areas with high levels of air pollution. Experts say the effects of this could be catastrophic.
The reason those air pollution has such a huge impact on our health is that it really attacks
almost every organ of our body. It comes in deep into our lungs, in some cases for the very fine particles and ultrafine particles, into the bloodstream, and it affects pretty much anything from our brain. It affects how, particularly how children's cognitive development and lung development is impaired. So we need to push that tendency so that we really transform our cities so that it's so easy to walk, bike, take public transportation everywhere. We have to do it.
While the UK has seen reductions in air pollution over the last decade, the government acknowledges there's still more to do. It says it's committed to setting stretching and ambitious targets. Ella's mum, Rosamond, is campaigning for change to come sooner rather than later. She hopes saving lives will be her daughter's legacy. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
And a reminder, you can catch the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News every weekday at the new time of 8:30 in the evening. Now, a year on from the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the former President Donald Trump is shrugging off attempts to hold him responsible and seems set on positioning himself as the commanding force behind the Republican Party. Here's our US correspondent, Mark Stone.
Washington, D.C., January 2022. A picture postcard image, but is it one which belies a troubling and divided reality? It's a year since the event now known simply as January 6th. A coup attempt, an insurrection, an effort certainly by supporters of Donald Trump to change the result of the election. As politicians hid and police were overrun, 5 people died and a nation was shaken. But 12 months on, Team Trump is as active as ever and as defiant as ever. Liz Harrington is Donald Trump's spokesperson.
And as President Trump likes to say, the real insurrection was the subversion of the American people's will on November 3rd. That was the theft. What January 6th was the protest.
He said, we will fight like hell.
And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
That was incitement, wasn't it?
No, that's nothing compared to what people on the left say. And you know he's speaking metaphorically.
But it has now emerged that as all this was unfolding, some of those closest to Mr. Trump, including his own son, were urging the president to intervene. It has gone too far, Don Jr. said in a text message. Over the past year, despite being banned from social media, Donald Trump has remained in constant campaign mode. And he has continued to claim, against all facts, but to audiences who believe him, that the election was stolen.
You are saying that former President Trump is still absolutely of the belief that he won the election in 2020?
Yeah, absolutely. And you look at different states.
Even though 64 out of 65 challenges in courts around this nation, when there have been recounts and recounts, they've checked very clearly, and those have been proven to be very fair elections or fair counts.
No matter how many times you count the same stuffed ballot box, it's still going to be a stuffed ballot box.
Yet audits too proved no wrongdoing, and the dominant view among historians, academics, those who would be dismissed as the establishment, is that democracy itself in America is in a perilous state.
Republicans up and down the country have arrived at a point where they look at January 6th as a blueprint, as a dress rehearsal, as a trial run for the next presidential election. And they are at the state level trying to get themselves in a position where at the next presidential election, they will be able to execute that blueprint more effectively as a way to hold on to power.
Donald Trump has not said whether he will run again, but a year since January the 6th, he has successfully positioned himself as the commanding force behind the Republican Party. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington, D.C.
The Liberal Democrats are calling for a tax on the profits of oil and gas firms to help people facing soaring energy costs. The leader of the Liberal Democrats and former Energy Secretary, Sir Ed Davey, joins me now. Good to talk to you today. Just explain, what is this? You're dubbing it the Robin Hood tax. What is it? How would it work?
We're really worried by the rising energy bills that people are facing. Rising gas prices means that people's heating bills will go up by at least 50%. Average energy bills rising by at least £700 next year. So we need help for people, but that has to be paid for. And alongside the gas prices hitting people's heating bills, they're also increasing profits of the oil and gas sector massively. The BP's chief executive said his company was a cash machine. So I think it's reasonable to do what's happened in the past and have a Robin Hood tax to tax some of that profits so we can afford to pay for real help for vulnerable people and people on low incomes.
But what message does this send to the rest of the world and to businesses who want to come and do business here in the UK, that at any point the UK government might turn around and say, actually, we're going to do this massive tax hike on you right now?
Well, this has been done by governments of all persuasions in the UK in the past. The Spanish have just done a windfall tax. So this is not unusual. Let's remember these profits were totally unexpected. They're absolutely massive. And it's simply unfair, Liberal Democrats think, that these large oil and gas companies, and indeed some small and medium-sized ones, some of the traders, are making massive profits, while people who are on low incomes may go hungry and cold this winter. We need to help people. So these are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And what Liberal Democrats are saying, we need to be able to take money straight off their heating bills. And we want to extend the support schemes to millions more people to help pensioners, to help people on low incomes, working families on low incomes with children. And if we help those people who are really struggling at the moment, I think it is reasonable to ask those firms who are making unexpectedly high profits to contribute.
I mean, fairness is a nice idea, isn't it? But the world isn't fair, is it? And this is a short-term fix. If you were able to tax these companies, it would just be a one-off.
Well, we only want a one-off tax, actually. We want the help to be this year. Hopefully gas prices and therefore heating bills will fall next year. And the long-term solution is to insulate people's homes more and to remove the amount of gas we need by going into renewables. Liberal Democrats, when I was Energy Secretary, did just that. We quadrupled renewable power, so we didn't need so much gas. We made Britain the world leader in offshore wind. Very proud of that Liberal Democrat record. Unfortunately, the Conservatives haven't taken that on. Moreover, we put energy efficiency and insulation into many, many people's homes. Over 1 million homes we insulated, so they need less gas to heat them, so their bills are protected. Unfortunately, under the Conservatives, those sorts of policies were absolutely reduced or ended entirely. There is no proper home insulation programme for anyone at the moment in the UK. That is a very bad thing for the long-term energy security of our country. It's bad for climate change, and it's really bad for bill payers. So Liberal Democrats have a short-term solution where we're going to increase things like the warm home discount, the pensioners' winter fuel allowance, paid for by these oil and gas companies. That's a good solution now to help people now. But we have solutions for the next year, for the years ahead, which will mean that we won't be in this situation in the future. I'm really quite angry, actually, on behalf of millions of people. The Conservatives have let us down with some really bad energy policies.
A lot of people will look at your ideas about renewable energy and will say, you know, that's something we can support. We think it's a good idea to not use the Earth's resources. But equally, using fully renewable energy in the future doesn't mean that our energy prices are going to go down, does it? It is things like insulation that will make the difference. We're not all suddenly going to see reduced bills if we get all our power from wind and wave, are we?
Well, you're right that energy insulation, home insulation is the best way, because then you're not using energy in the first place. That's why Liberal Democrats have championed home insulation energy efficiency, and the Conservatives have had a dreadful record on it. But actually, renewable energy is now the cheapest energy. Thanks to the policies that Liberal Democrats introduced, the price of renewable energy has tumbled. And so in the future, renewable power will be much cheaper than fossil fuel power. And moreover, we don't have to import it. So I don't see why the government aren't doing far, far more to invest in the offshore wind industry, but also the solar and tidal industry. This will make Britain far more independent, far more secure. It will help people with their bills, and it will help climate change. The government's failure to go further and faster on renewables, building on the work that Liberal Democrats did, is a real betrayal of our country. And I say that in strong terms.
This Prime Minister in particular has failed our country on energy policies, and that's why people are ending up with such high heating bills.
While we have you here, the government's announced changes in COVID restrictions for travel from Friday, and also reductions in PCR testing. Are those both changes that the Lib Dems welcome?
They look the right things. What I'd like to see from this government on not just these changes, but all changes, is far more transparency with the advice from the scientists and the experts. The problem with Boris Johnson over COVID is he hasn't taken the advice of some of the experts, we find afterwards. And moreover, because he hasn't obeyed the rules that he's required everyone else to obey, there's a lot of people who don't trust him anymore. And in a public health crisis, we need the government to be trusted. And this Prime Minister has undermined people's trust in what the government say. So I think it's absolutely essential as we go forward and tackle this appalling pandemic and protect people, we have much more transparency on what the experts are actually saying. And that way, we might be able to restore some trust and therefore tackle this pandemic far more effectively.
OK, and while we have you, finally, is Lindsay Hoyle off your Christmas card list for next year after he got your name wrong yesterday and called you Ed Balls?
No, not at all. Not at all. It's an easy mistake to make, and his office has apologised, so I take that in very good spirit.
There are so many Eds, but it's good to have you on. Ed Davey, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let's get a look at the weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll turn wet and windy from the west today with snow on the hills. Britain mostly dry and calm with an extensive frost, severe in some places. Ireland and Northern Ireland will see any frost soon lifting as wind and rain spread from the west. Northern and Western Britain will turn wet and windy this morning with coastal gales. There'll be snow on the hills and to low levels in the north for a time. Elsewhere, eastern England will stay fine, while Ireland and Northern Ireland will see rain giving way to blustery, wintry showers, some of those heavy and thundery. It'll be cold in the east, milder elsewhere. Rain and hill snow will clear into the east later.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up, we'll have the latest as Novak Djokovic appeals against the cancellation of his visa ahead of this month's Australian Open. There's a hearing currently happening in Australia. If we get any decision from it, we will bring it to you here on Sky News Breakfast.